Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action Red Alert China, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani. I'll be dealing the questions. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit that like button. Also comment, share, and subscribe. To enjoy sneak previews of our videos, exclusive content, and more special programming in the works, join our Patreon page, patreon.com/thought-to-action. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to our Ask Us Anything sessions, and they get really crazy sometimes. We do answer your questions, and that's where we at the London Center do that. We will also be putting together live streams very soon, so keep an eye out. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Getter, all the social media, our website, londoncenter.org, and we have a Thought to Action Teespring store. We're going to offer all sorts of merchandise. We have some now. You'll see it right here. New items are coming soon. It's going to be exciting. The link is in our video and podcast descriptions. Our panel for this edition of Thought to Action Red Alert China. London Center for Policy Research President, Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, London Center Distinguished Fellow Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien, London Center Senior Fellow Jay Homnick, and Foreign Policy Fellow with the Independent Women's Forum, Claudia Rosett. Let's start with this. While the Western world is watching the Russia-Ukraine war and looking to find ways to keep Putin at bay in the future, China is watching. China is not just watching the war. The CCP sees a weak American administration, a weak European Union. Is China going to pounce on Taiwan soon, as President Xi has threatened before, or will he take a wait-and-see approach? Tony, we'll start with you.
I think this is something that a lot of people are noodling over, and many without any regard to the facts or background or history. So I'd like to open it up with Claudia, letting her kind of go through and talk about the foundational issues that I don't think people fully understand. Claudia, do you mind kind of walking through? Because I was under the misconception, I'll openly admit, that we had a treaty with the Republic of China with Taiwan, and apparently we don't. Can you explain what our actual defense relationship is and why it's important, relating to Chris's question regarding what people may draw away from the Ukraine invasion and what China may be thinking to do?
Sure. Yeah. The problem here is that as soon as you get into the area of, as we've seen in Ukraine, that the US will defend, President Biden is saying we will fight for every square inch of NATO territory, those countries in a formal alliance, but we will send no troops to Ukraine, which was a very foolish thing to say, even if he didn't plan to. It told Putin we wouldn't send troops. Taiwan ends up, by that calculus, sort of naked to the wind, because we don't even recognize Taiwan. We deal with them under this sort of, it's kind of a mystical diplomatic arrangement that has managed to nurse things along for decades. But China insists that Taiwan is part of China. The US has never actually sort of spelled out how that arrangement works. We have a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that says we will look for a peaceful solution to whatever's going on with Taiwan and with Taipei and Beijing, but Taiwan and China, but and that we will do what we can to ensure their defense. But we don't have a formal commitment, as we do with NATO, to come in and, all for one and one for all. So Xi Jinping has got to be looking with great interest at the sort of the fastidious points that President Biden has made, where right now you have all the might of NATO, and that's mostly the might of the US, parked behind NATO's defensive lines, quote, standing with Ukraine as we seek, to avoid escalation with Putin. And just one more important thing, there's a lot more to say on this, but you have wonderful people here to talk about it as well, is that if you look at how Putin is behaving right now, he and Xi Jinping put out this joint statement on February 4th, the opening day of the Olympics in Beijing, declaring a new world order in which they were the ascendant powers. And it went on for some time, spelling out the various ways that they are now partners, want to cooperate. It then ended rather abruptly on ASEAN, leaving me wondering, well, what else did they agree on that we haven't heard about? Right. And I would be quite concerned about that, because Putin at this point is sort of going for broke as far as demolishing Ukraine. What is he expecting is going to come in, my fear, to distract us? And that's where I would look to Asia, China, Taiwan. And she's got to be aware that we have an extremely weak American president who would be so foolish as to say, we will send no troops up front.
Well, I think that's a point I want to make before I open it up to everybody else. And just to defend Gordon Chang, without he needs no defense. I just want to make sure that his voice is represented here as one of our senior fellows. You know, I asked Gordon about this the other day when we were talking. I said, do you believe, Gordon, and I'm sure we'll have him on to clarify this if I get it wrong, but do you believe that the Chinese, the People's Republic of China, will do something to take advantage of Ukraine, like within the next few months? He said no. He thinks that first off, the Chinese have too many. The People's Republic of China, I'm sorry, the People's PRC, the CCP have too many internal problems that they're dealing with right now to focus on Taiwan. And secondly, they do want to essentially do an evaluation of what Putin does and our responses, so they can better, I think, maybe even forecast how we'll do it. So do you think that Gordon, and the last point is that Gordon does believe they're going to go with a military option regarding Taiwan before Biden leaves office? So Claudia, any opinion about what I just said,
Yeah.
Gordon? I just want to make sure that I'm trying to represent Gordon's position here on this. So
I think we don't actually know the sequencing. It's a guess on everyone's part.
Right.
Gordon is looking at the party Congress later this year. She wants that third term, having lifted term limits and so on. I would not be surprised. So this is a bit of an equivocation, forgive me, but I don't know.
Oh, no, I get it. No.
I would not be surprised if she were to make a move sooner. He's got, right now, we are very busy with Eastern Europe. The US is focused on that. We don't have a lot of resources to handle both fronts. And China has a history, in my experience, which goes back to watching how they came into Tiananmen Square in 1989, watching what they did in Hong Kong in 2019, 2020. You can see it coming, and yet people don't want to believe it. Sort of like the mass troops around Ukraine.
Right.
And look at the military that Xi Jinping has been built up. Look at that incredibly audacious declaration of partnership, ascendancy, and so on with Putin, who has now gone ahead with the war. I think we have to assume that Putin and Xi, that Xi not only knew about it, but they discussed the sequencing and how they would handle this between them. They might not have known exactly what sanctions the US would put on, but there were a lot of preparations in the works that you can see. Things as simple as arrangements for money transfers between Russia and China before the US put on the sanctions after the invasion. So I wouldn't rule out at all that it would happen quite soon. I would brace for it any time. I think our own government would be very wise to look at it as a very imminent threat. And would Xi Jinping try to make his move while Biden or Kamala Harris is president? I think without question. It's been clear for some time that this is what another China watcher, Captain Jim Fennell, calls the decade of concern. And the question is, when in the decade? Well, there's a prime moment right now. Again, you have this very weak White House trying desperately, terrified to send old MiGs into Ukraine. Xi Jinping has to be looking at that. And the question isn't even, part of the question is militarily, what resources do we have to deal with him? But the question above that is there the will in the White House to do anything? Or would we say, this is Taiwan's fight, we'll try and send them weapons and so on, but basically it's their problem. And much as we have seen, remember Hong Kong, one of the world's great free cities. They didn't have an army. This hasn't been an armed conflict, but they are just sliding down into darkness right now.
Right.
They're gone. And will we see the same thing repeated on a horrific scale, possibly kinetic, with Taiwan? Don't rule it out, and don't assume it will take a long time.
So yeah, there's a couple of aspects of this I want to throw out to the audience, or our team, for the audience to better understand. Claudia, I really appreciate the way you frame that, by the fact that The military aspect of this is something that is a bit of a mystery, and it's not. Right now, one of the things that we, the United States, has done, with or without full NATO approval, but with the Polish approval, is we've moved 3 of our best armor brigades into Poland. We actually have them now. We actually have on the border, near the border, our best armor, the M1A2 SEP3s. I mean, this is the top of the line stuff. We've got Marines, as noted, in Norway. We have our best military, or at least ground forces there, with a pretty good number of our Air Force supporting it. I would argue that's all we can do. There's no capacity to go to should we have to go defend Taiwan at this point. And worse, if in North Korea decides to do something, a lot of the reserves that are already tapped for Europe are double tapped by the fact, for example, and I'll ask Pete to talk about this a little bit, the U.S. Marine Corps, the MARCENT folks, who are supposed to be the ones that go in to support any contingency in South Korea, are actually supposed to go into the Middle East if anything happens there. So what if what if everything happens at once? There's no bench to go to. There's no capacity to push back and move forward. And Pete, just to you on that, do you think that maybe because of what Claudia just said regarding the coordination of Z and Putin, have they walked through the numbers of our reserves and tried to figure out once there can, Putin may well be trying to draw us into at least get things postured in Europe. That means they're not available for the Pacific. Should we do something? Do you think that's something that Z and Putin are considering?
Well, absolutely. That's strategy 101. What is my enemy capable of doing, and how fast, how much, where, kind of thing. And I think it's important to look at this. At least part of what we need to do is put ourselves in their situation here. If I'm Xi, I'm looking at this. I'm not looking at this from a timeline. I'm looking at this from an events line. I'm looking at this and say, okay, what kind of things do I need in order to go here? And if I were sitting in Beijing right now, I would turn to my senior military commanders in particular, and ask them a couple of questions. But before I did, I would also think of one issue. I've got one issue coming up here in 2 days, and that's the first Russian default. I think it's $117 billion default, and that may be a good thing from Beijing's perspective. As I'm sitting looking out on the world from Beijing's perspective, that would be something that, let's see what happens when that default takes place. Let's just see what sequence of events transpire following that default, because that's going to tell us an awful lot about how much resilience the Western world really has to respond to a whole host of issues based upon what happens in the immediate wake of that default. But then I would turn to my, again, I'm playing Emperor Xi, is I would turn to the generals and say, okay, based upon what we've seen in Ukraine, what we've seen in NATO, are we ready to go, or do we need to change things? And if we need to change things, are they little things, or are they big things? And is there something that we clearly missed that has been displayed by what's going on in Ukraine, or are these small things that we can adjust and we can be ready to go? Because I know you've told me, generals, you've told me that there is a season that I need to attack if I'm going to go after Taiwan. I have a season. There's a weather issue here. I'm not going to start this after September. I'm probably not going to start this after middle of August. So I've got a window here, and I've got to sit back and scratch my head and say, when are we going to go here? And I have to make sure that we can do this whole thing and be wrapped up by 1 September. So, what's the plan here, General? And then I turn to the generals and I throw a conditions-based assessment onto the general and say, you fill in the blanks here, you tell me what needs to happen. And I think that would be the reasonable thing. I assume that he's a rational man, is that he's going to turn to his generals and say, please fill in the blanks for me here. Are we ready to go in light of what we've seen? Are we ready to go? And how fast can we go? And can we get this thing done by 1 September?
So Claudia, and I'm going to kick us over to Jay. Claudia said, and I think rightfully so, that everybody thinks of this as unthinkable. The invasion of Ukraine was thought of as unthinkable. I'm sorry, a lot of us thought it was very thinkable based on the patterns that were developing. So Jay, what do you make of the potential for the unthinkable, especially regarding the economics of Taiwan? I mean, remember that Taiwan produces the chip that goes into most U.S. cars. I'm sure China's aware of this, and I'm sure that China, the PRC, is well aware of the damage to the world economy. So how do you see this playing out regarding the unthinkable and the economics of it?
Well, let's go backwards and then we'll go forwards. Let's just review the process that we've gone through here as a team. We predicted from the beginning that Taiwan and Ukraine were going to go together, that Putin was going to invade Ukraine and then she was going to invade Taiwan. And we outpredicted the US intelligence, because US intelligence said that Putin was going to go in the middle of the Olympics. And we said, no, there's no way. Since it's obviously a deal with Xi, he's not going in the middle of the Olympics. He can only set up in the middle of the Olympics, but he can't go in until after. So the London Center for Policy Research outperformed the CIA and all the professionals in following it to this stage. And now we're ready, we're looking ahead. So people would be well advised to follow our analysis, because we're right up there with the big boys. And here's what I'd like to contribute. I think that, yes, as we foresaw, she gave the green light to Putin to do this, thinking that it's going to be a good setup for him in Taiwan, because it's going to be 2 losses in a row for the United States. They first, got embarrassed in Afghanistan. Now they're going to be embarrassed in Ukraine. And then they'll be softened up for the next move on Taiwan. They're not going to have a lot of fight left in them. But the fact that the Russian army has performed so badly, I mean, badly is not even a word. It's like it's a comedy level. If you're doing a film and you wanted to create a comic effect of a bumbling army that's not getting its job done, this is exactly what it would look like. So consequently, I think that has set Xi way back. I mean, certainly it set Putin way back, but I think that has to have set Xi way back, because basically Russia, Soviet Union, whatever you want to call them, they've turned into India or Pakistan, which is they only have big bombs, but they don't have armies. That's not the kind of power you don't want to, enrage, because they can hurt you. But that's not the power you have to worry about fighting in a war, because in a war, they only have the boom effect. They don't have the ability to fight a war. And so, but she does have the ability to fight a war. But now he realized that he picked the wrong ally, in a sense. I mean, maybe that was the only ally. But it doesn't give a good model for him to then go into Taiwan. He certainly learned lessons from the mistakes, and he certainly has better performing troops and more disciplined and more capable. And he doesn't need to throw big crazy bombs at Taiwan to beat him. But he's got to be back on his heels thinking, well, as a great power, I'm now more powerful than I was before, because my partner's weak. But that also means that I have to rethink everything. I'm now here as a lone player rather than as the head of some kind of a serious team. And but again, as we pointed out, the minute the congressional elections happen, and the prospect is that Republicans will get majorities, that's going to weaken Biden even further. And they probably wanted to do it before the elections, but they have to be rethinking now. It might be too soon, because Putin's bumbling failure here has definitely set them back.
Very good point, Jay. And it was brought up earlier that Xi would most likely make his move while Biden was president, putting together a showdown between Winnie the Pooh and the big guy. The window, however, may be closing soon. Considering that, though, there is still a lot of US and China business interdependencies, which may wind up changing drastically with an annexation/invasion. Although, arguably, that might not happen as well, considering how deep a lot of our very powerful businesses are into Beijing. How might this come into play, or perhaps not come into play, with the CCP's decision to take Taiwan?
Well, let me just follow up on that real quick, because it's sort of the end part of what I said before, which is that a very important message that she has gotten from this encounter is the fact that all these businesses got together very strongly. In a way, the businesses were actually pulling the United States government. And that is sort of a new kind of a domino theory that didn't exist before. Everyone has to rethink strategy because of the ability of the businesses to become military players of a kind, paramilitary players. But and so where China is a little bit, may want to wait a little while, because right now, if China made a move, the businesses would kind of be trapped into doing the same thing to China that they did to Russia. If China waited a year, the businesses would come up with some excuse to differentiate between the Russia situation and the China situation, because they don't want to hurt themselves too much. But right now is not the time for them to make that move, because the businesses, I think, just by inertia, would have to keep going in the path that they're on.
A couple of comments or things just to think about there. First, the overarching picture I'm seeing is that we are behaving as a country afraid of that big boom. On the Russian army, I am not a military expert. As I said, I defer to all of you on that. But I did see the Yeltsin assault on Grozny in 1994-95 and have followed what they've done since. And as I have observed it, the Russian army always messes up. It is a disaster. It's a rolling disaster. The thing that prevails is they keep going.
Yes.
It's a bit like their space station, the old Mir, which by the time it finally they crashed it out of orbit, had sprung leaks, grew fungus. I mean, it was a mess. The cosmonauts got drunk the night before they went up, and yet they managed to patch it up, and it clanked along, and it ran for 15 years instead of the commission 5. And I'm sorry to say that I think that is the model to think of for the Russian military. Of course they messed up. I doubt that she is even that surprised. I doubt that Putin is necessarily even that surprised if you look at the record. But what they do is exactly what they've been doing in, say, Mariupol. They keep going. They destroy. And destruction, if you're, okay, there's that first. So I would be a little more worried on that front, that while it might not have been the cakewalk that Putin probably would have liked, it's far from over. On the sanctions in China, let's flip to the economist end of things. I've spent, I don't know, 20 years looking at how people get around sanctions. My husband, Tim Wilson, who's one of your fellows at the London Center, worked with me on tracking shipping evasion of sanctions some years ago by Iran and North Korea. And what I can tell you there is that human ingenuity is just stunning when there's a lot of money to be made. And as soon as people start putting sanctions on something, people start looking for ways around them. And it's a dynamic process. It's not like you build a dike, we sanction Russia and there it will stay. It's that they are already working ways around it. What are the workarounds? There's always Aunt Minnie with a front company in Hong Kong, which actually turns out to be a company that will order you 200 off the shelf other front companies. And the time it takes Treasury to track those down and sanction one of them, they can do 6 more. The metrics are not great. Sanctions erode. So you've got that problem already as far as Russia. Don't look for the sanctions, these desperate sanctions to stick. We've seen the initial shock, but it's like giving a big dose of antibiotics. If you keep doing it, they start to find ways around it. For China, the problem is even bigger. And here we get into the question of, was there a sequencing agreement between Putin and Xi over who invades when? And my guess would be they didn't need to do it in synchronized swimmers in perfect coordination. You would want a sequence. You would want what distracts us, what does this, how do you sequence it? And the fact that we've put these sanctions on Russia makes it harder for us, more costly for us to now look at putting severe sanctions on China. Because you do get to a point where if you have sanctioned half the world, you are sanctioning yourself. We're cutting ourselves off while creating a trading bloc that consists of them. And they know this. And if you look at our behavior with China, the US has been terrified for years of big sanctions on China for precisely that reason, as Jay was talking about. Think back to when we were sanctioning North Korea. The US focused with reason. I know this because Treasury officials finally came out and told us this. They focused on a little bank in Macau to try and sort of teach there was then Kim Jong-il a lesson, Banco Delta Asia. The real offender, Tim and I dropped by Banco Delta Asia shortly after that in Macau years ago. And the aggrieved bank manager pointed out quite rightly that the real offender was Bank of China. It was afraid to sanction Bank of China. It was too big. That is the problem there. That is what they have to know. And while we may well finally put big sanctions on China, A, sanctions don't win wars, B, they tend to erode, and C, the more we put them on, the less ability we have to then influence more by adding more. It's diminishing returns. So it comes back to, are we willing to stand up in the end and say, you do this, you've got your big boom, sort of what President Trump said, we've got a bigger boom and you do not terrify us. The problem right now is we look terrified.
So to that point, Claudia, I think it's the way you framed it, I think is completely correct, especially if you start looking at personality. So one of the things that's obvious is that the same people who made the mistakes under Biden, under Obama, yeah. under Obama.
Same thing.
Blinken was there in the office when I was just watching the thing on Frontline. As a matter of fact, that's why I was late. I was actually watching boy, it's interesting to watch the Atlantic and the neocons, how they shape things. It's always like they put enough fact in there to make it look interesting. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. I'll get in trouble. Anyway, but Blinken was in the room when Obama was chiding Putin, putting all these sanctions on. To your point, it's like, yeah, you sanction us all the time. We're okay. Doesn't really matter. So it's deja vu all over again. They do the sanctions, has no effect because, yeah, we've already done that. And then you look at all of these silly things that the Biden folks are doing, same as Obama. It's like it's deja vu all over again, literally. And I think
it's the same people. It's Wendy
exactly.
It's Sullivan, as you said, it's Tony Blinken. It's you run down the list, and they're doing the same things right down to the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. It's like they're doing the same. And so Putin sees this. Putin knows that Biden is not backed up by anyone who's going to deviate, therefore ensuring, I would argue it was inevitable. Once Putin saw all the same players show up from the Biden administration, he knew he could go and could go successfully. And to your point, Claudia, I don't think Putin cares about casualties. The Russians have, according to Pete's estimate, have the casualty rate the same as the Battle of Kursk in World War II. I don't think they care. It's like, I'm sure if Putin was briefed on, he would say, and it's like, it's like they're just going to keep going until they get the mission done. And I don't think Xi sees things all that differently than Putin. I think there's going to be coordination a little bit, but I think they see benefit. The Chinese see benefit in supporting Russia through its economic challenges. I think they're a good place to go. And I'd like to believe that they're watching what they do. And they want to have U.S. forces deploy as much forward into Europe, because trust me, once they get into the interior of Europe, you just can't pull them out and put them into the Pacific. It's not logistically sound. You can't do it. There's just no way to do it if we get everything in there. So I think this is indeed a twofer for those two. And I think I'd like to believe the Chinese army did learn some lessons from its incursion into Vietnam. People tend to forget that there was an armed conflict between Vietnam and China. China lost pretty much, but that doesn't mean that they haven't learned some lessons and are not learning lessons now from watching the Russians. With that said, they're going to go, I think, with the same thing. I mean, that's how they were able to overwhelm us in Korea in 51, 52, when they were able to do swarm attacks into North Korea. So, Pete, what do you think? I mean, I'm sorry, Claudia, go ahead. No, Claudia, go
I
ahead.
was gonna say there's a fascinating propaganda movie worth watching as propaganda, The Battle at Lake Changjin, which came out in China last winter, which is about the Battle at Chosin Reservoir. And in that, it's a completely warped version. America unprovoked invades North Korea.
Yeah.
There are no North Koreans in the movie. It's just Chinese fighting the overfed, arrogant Americans until they're defeated. And China is playing on that right now. It's part of how they're sort of rousing nationalist sentiment inside China. It's a huge hit there. It's an awful movie, but it's interesting to see for that reason.
Interesting.
If I can just throw in a couple of thoughts here on all of this. The first thing I'd add, we haven't dragged this in, but it is worth mentioning, is that the week before Putin launched his assault into Ukraine, he met with the president of Iran.
Mhm.
And it just kind of keep that one in the back of your head, because as we're going through all this, we're about to sign a piece of paper with Iran, perhaps. Looks like it will. And what exactly that piece of paper will give to Iran remains to be seen. But arguably, it's going to benefit Iran more than it's going to benefit us, and just something to keep in the back of our head. As we grind through all this, I think it's an important point to go back and look at just what nuclear deterrence was. The guy who started this whole thing going was a guy who knew what he was talking about. It was Eisenhower. Eisenhower understood war planning. He understood, what worked and what didn't. And as we kind of polished that large irregular stone into something that was fairly easy to on the eyes, a couple of things come out that identify how a working deterrence model is set up. And there's a couple of things you need to have, and we've kind of let these pieces start to fritter away. The first thing is you need a capable conventional force that allows you essentially to deal with another nuclear power at the conventional level, and if you will, contain the problem conventionally. The second thing is you need a nuclear force that is clearly well trained and well equipped and capable across a broad spectrum of warfare, broad spectrum of nuclear warfare, so that the enemy understands that there isn't some hole in your capability that they can exploit. The third thing you need, and the third thing is where this is really important, is there needs to be a clear understanding that there is in fact a hard line out there that if they step on it, if the enemy steps on it, there will be a nuclear response.
Right.
There has to be a very clear understanding that someplace out there is a hard line and there will be nuclear weapons coming down range. And the fourth thing, and this is the interesting piece to it, is they must not know where that line is. So you have those four pieces. And then the question becomes is, have we maintained those four facets of this interesting problem set? And the answer is no, we have not. No. And therefore, the deterrence is failing. And when, for example, you stand up and you identify clearly where a line is, we're not going to do that. You then invite them to go right up to that line and do whatever they want short of it. And therein lies the problem. And the fact that we have done that in Ukraine, and we of course we de facto did that in Syria. What was that, 10 years ago, when we said, that's a red line, and they tapped the red line, and then we did nothing. Those are horribly weakening situations when you start talking about getting your hands around deterrence. Yep. And that's the problem we're fighting right now.
So look, Bud McFarlane actually said a while back, we were talking about deterrence, and he said the moment the Russians signed the SALT agreement, they started acting out more aggressively because they knew where the line was. He said that. He said the same, and he said that's why after we had the Iranian deal in place, they started working more aggressively in Yemen with the Houthi because they knew where the line was. So Bud would, I think, agree with you completely, Pete, on your points based on his own experience, and that's the point. Is that we actually do have people who understand this, like the Reagan team that supports us behind the scenes, but that expertise is ignored for purposes of political expedience by those in charge. And let me say a couple things about that point. It seems to me, Claudia, especially for you, who's what witnesses more than us more directly, it seems to me that you have people in the White House, Jake Sullivan, you mentioned some of the names, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, Jen Psaki, they're all acting from a position of weakness and somehow believing if we're just nice, we're going to be able to resolve this.
Tony, one of
the
the staggering moments was the news comes out that China had tested hypersonic missiles last summer, and Jen Psaki's first response was, "We welcome stiff competition," as if they were making sneakers.
Yeah.
China actually, according to the Washington Times, sailed a warship right near Taiwan as well. What I believe they're doing, and again, tell me if I'm far off. You're the experts. I'm just the guy with a smile. Anyway, the idea is I'm almost under the belief that China is milking this for all it can politically. They seem to want to toy with the Biden administration. If they attack Taiwan too soon, they believe they can run through it. Nothing's going to happen because we're tied up with not only Russia, but too many business interests with China. Nobody's going to fight back. But if the threat's there, if China can think diplomatically and economically, it can get what it wants. It can scare other administrations into doing what it wants by saying, hey, we're going to hang this. We're going to jump into Hong Kong and China and Taiwan thing over everybody for the next 10, 15 years. Why bother taking over Taiwan if they can do it in our heads already, or at least the Washington leadership's heads?
Chris, on that point, I mean, this is why they engage diplomatically. I mean, to Claudia's point as well, it's like when you have stupid stuff said like that, it's like, oh, we know how we can get them. That's why China and other countries stay members of the Paris Climate Accord, knowing full well they'll never do anything. They'll never support their end of it because these stupid Americans keep paying for it, and they keep reducing our capacity militarily and economically by burdening ourselves on this incessant CO2 removal effort. CO2 is a freaking plant food, for God's sake. Mankind produces less than a fraction of a percent produced by everything else in the planet. So when the Chinese see this, it's like, oh yeah, we'll sign up to that, knowing full well they'll never do anything, but we will. So this is why they're so, we're the stupid ones here because we keep falling for the same thing.
Tony, may I?
Remember that when you reduce CO2, that small percentage, it actually underscores the fact that all we could ever raise it was that small percentage. So the whole premise was false to begin with, that our activity is raising the CO2 enough to affect the world. So by creating the first false premise that we're the ones who made the problem, we then naturally engender the second false premise that we can solve it by stop doing what we're doing.
Right.
We didn't make it happen.
Guess who's paying for the green movement?
Under.
Guess who's paying for the green movements?
Could I jump in on this and
funding.
say a word about the United Nations and the world order? Okay, the UN is a gigantic, incompetent mess, and at the same time, it is the world's leading multilateral body, and it gets quite a platform. That's the sort of source. The Paris Climate is not of the UN. It's of the UN, not under the UN, but it's very much the whole arrangement you're talking about. The deal being the US will trash our economy now in exchange for promises that China will trash its economy in 20 years.
Right.
That's the deal. And bad deal. But a very big thing that feeds into the immediate question of Ukraine, Taiwan, and so on is the Iran nuclear deal. And it's important to understand how that connects with the UN, where, remember, during the Cold War, it was sort of paralyzed there because of the Soviet Union versus the US. China has been more and more just infesting the UN at many, many levels. And part of what is going on with the Iran nuclear deal right now, the Biden administration is desperate to get back into that. It's the cast of characters Tony was talking about. the same group that helped negotiate it, especially Wendy Sherman, John Kerry brought it home, same crowd. And how is the Iran nuclear deal structured for negotiation? The answer is President Obama, when he first brought this thing up, knew that it would not pass the Senate as a treaty. The runaround was to submit it to the UN Security Council for their approval. That was his proxy for the US Constitution, which was bad, but that's what he did. For that, he needs the permanent 5 of the Security Council to sign off. That would be the UK, US, France, Russia, and China. He must have them on board. That's why he needs them at the table, because he's got to have the UN Security Council P5 approving this thing once they get to some deal and take it back to the Security Council. That's the route that they're planning. That means that while all this has been going on, this tremendous leverage has been handed to both Russia and China at the Iran negotiating table, where Russia has become the broker because the Iranians refused to talk directly to the Americans. And you couldn't have a more perverse scene. It also would not surprise me if it takes a while longer, if they drag out these negotiations, because every day that deal is in big play in Vienna is another day that Russia has major leverage over the same US top diplomats who are right now trying to figure out how to deal with Ukraine and Taiwan. So that's how dangerous, that's how much we're being played, and that's how much our own administration is basically groveling in order to get things that it thinks are important while at terrible risk to security. But that's a big factor here too.
Let me just say this point, that it's important to remember, that there are action memos and then there are observation memos. And a very important observation memo is the fact that Putin is the only person. There's a difference between Russia and China. In China, if she goes, another guy takes over, and it's got all the same power and all the same drive forward. Russia is dependent on one person. So it's like with Stalin. If he dies tomorrow, the whole calculus changes. And so it's a little bit, it's just an observation memo. It's not an action memo. We're not going to kill him. But we need to keep our eye on that, because if he goes, the whole ball game changes, and Russia now becomes a country with a weak army and some nuclear weapons, and none of that type of dynamism at the top.
Can I say one thing, maybe to just try and find some slightly upbeat note to end this on?
That would be nice. We'd like that.
Okay. First is just perhaps a bit of counsel. We're all trying to think, how can we advise the current administration to clean up, to do better?
Yeah.
It's possible that they are not going to listen no matter how good the arguments. So perhaps one project that the wonderful minds assembled here could also be tackling is, if you assume that things will go very, very wrong, that all these bad things are going to play out before there's a chance to remedy this from the US side, then where do you pick up your planning? What do you do to try and recover at that stage, assuming that all these things happen? But then the other thing is the American character, and that is, we are a people who love freedom, and it's been a very bad couple of years, but I don't think that's gone. And it is so vital that Americans who understand that and care about it stand up and say it loud, say it with no apology, because that is where we begin to recover. That's where we say, wait a minute, we don't want a world order run by Russia and China. We actually have incredible things to contribute, and this is what we now propose to do. It's so important that all of you do that. It does get heard, and people do understand. And America is a country of enthusiasms. We decide that liquor's no good, we have prohibition. That doesn't work out, we go the other way. We don't want to get into World War II. We watch Britain fight alone, as Ukraine is doing now, for what, almost 2 years. And finally, when we have no real choice, we get into the war and we win it. We've got to win this one. It's just, surrender is not an option. Thank you for the chance to join all of you.
Thank you, Claudia. No, look, I think Pete could be the best quoter of, who was it that planned the Pearl Harbor invasion and said, I fear all we've done is awaken a terrible resolve. What was that?
Well,
Pete?
that was Yamamoto, the admiral in charge of the Japanese Navy.
And I think that's what is on at stake here is that I think we're going to be pushed. Unfortunately, we have inept leaders who I think by their own political desires, their aspirations are dangerous to the very fabric of the republic by the fact it encourages aggression. I'd like to believe that's an accurate statement. And I agree with you, Claudia. We I think have to be prepared to aggressively pick up the pieces and move forward to reestablish. I got into a debate one time, and this is on the internet. You can check it out. Ron Paul and I got into a debate when he announced. I was on John Stossel's show back when it was on Fox, and I was asked to come in and debate Ron Paul on his libertarian stance that we shouldn't be policing the world. And I am not a neocon. I'm not. But I did believe, I said, we have invested, for better or for worse, in the current order where we guarantee lines of communication and commerce all around the world. And despite the fact I don't believe we should be the world policeman, I don't believe it's in our interest to give that up to the Chinese. And I said this during the debate. It's like, it's not our job, but it is our job, and it's we have this responsibility. So I think this is where, Claudia, I'd like to believe we all would all agree that there is a level of responsibility we have self-established that it has been in the best interest of the world to have us, whether they like it or not, to be the arbiters of fairness. And I think I'd like to believe we have been a very fair, I'll just say it, we have been a fair empire. Because we have been the empire.
We have brought the world more good things than
Exactly.
any civilization in the history of.
Exactly. So I think it's time we all take a deep breath and get over the left's desire to demean us as a country and say, yeah, it's time. We're not perfect, but we have been the arbiters of fairness globally. We have been good for the planet, and I think that's something that we need to reconsider. Reestablishing that capacity, because the Russians aren't going to do it, the Chinese aren't going to do it, and I think that if we do want to see the best possible world for our children and for other generations yet unborn, I think we have to understand that we do have a responsibility to the planet to maintain a level of peace that will bring prosperity to the planet. That may be radical to say, but I think that's what we
By the
need.
way, this has been a good model. Zelensky inspires Europe, and Europe inspires us.
I remember when Zelensky was public enemy #1 for a few months when he got elected. So
There's a great video of him playing piano out there.
Something very interesting about Zelensky is he's a master of basically he's an actor. He's a public speaker. He's a master of getting people to go along with his side. So while the Russian attack, maybe they're a lot stronger militarily, the World Court of Public Opinion is definitely on Ukraine's side, and a lot of that is thanks to Zelensky's, I don't want to say posturing in a bad way, but his ability to be convincing. And that is, of course, something we can discuss on another program. But that's important when he's militarily outmatched. Luckily he has, but luckily he has people who are willing to fight from behind the shadows and in cellars and things like that, and insurgencies that may last decades because of the fight, the verbal fight he puts out there, and of course the resolve of the Ukrainian people. We discussed this before. Many of them, they know their history. They know about Holodomor. They know about living under Soviet rule at the time, Russian rule altogether. They don't want that again. And they'll fight it. They're going to fight it tooth and nail. That's another thing we can discuss when it comes to Hong Kong and Taiwan, if the Chinese try to take them over as well.
That'll be our next China Red Alert.
Absolutely.
There we go. As for this one, I want to thank you all for being with us for this Red Alert China version of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research, where we explore the ongoing threats from Communist China. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment on our discussion. We appreciate your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound the big red bell for updates on future shows. That's, of course, if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on Rumble, it's the green button for subscriptions. Find out more about the London Center for Policy Research on our website, londoncenter.org. And if you'd like to help us continue to create discussions and programming like this, please join our Patreon page, patreon.com/thought to action. You can enjoy sneak previews, exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. Also, you can help us greatly by sharing this video with friends, colleagues, and social networks. Remember to pick up some cool merch. We do have some cool merch at our Thought to Action Teespring store. We'll be adding new items very soon. Keep your eye out. The link is in our video and podcast descriptions. For our panel at the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one.